Legend says that after World War II, Frank Capra lost touch with America, that his positivity and populism didn't track with the public anymore, and that he never made another successful or another particularly good movie. Okay, It's a Wonderful Life came out in 1946, but it wasn't a hit when it was released. There's a lot of interesting trivia about that movie, complicated production history, tumultuous response, life in the public domain, and its rise to being a classic. But we're not talking about It's a Wonderful Life today. Instead, we're going even farther to look at Frank Capra's last movie to see if things really did fall apart. Frank Capra's last film was called Pocketful of Miracles, at least his last theatrical narrative film. It came out in 1961. It's almost hard to believe that Capra made a movie in the 60s. Of course, he died only in the 90s, but this was his last movie. It starred Bette Davis and Glenn Ford, not exactly up-and-coming talent, alongside a healthy assortment of character actors. It also features Peter Falk in one of his first film roles. He narrates the film, so now you know where The Princess Bride got that idea. Falk was actually nominated for an Academy Award for this movie, and it got 2 other nominations, one for Best Original Song and one for Costume Design. Not exactly the most exciting awards, but this doesn't exactly sound like a flop. If you told someone about this movie but didn't mention the year, they might ask you why the heck Peter Falk is in it. And they might be generally pretty optimistic about the film. So what is a Frank Capra movie from 1961 like? How does Frank Capra fuse his unique sensibility with this new Technicolor world of the 1960s? Well, if that's what you're hoping to find in Pocketful of Miracles, you're going to be disappointed about 0 seconds into the movie, because it's instantly obvious that this film is set in the past. It seems like most of the movie takes place in the early 30s, although the historicism is a little vague here, and I wasn't sure exactly the year. In fact, if you've done a little bit of research, you would know that this movie is actually a remake of an earlier Frank Capra film from 1933 called Lady for a Day. Interesting trivia question there about directors who've remade their own films. There's some Hitchcock ones, and this one, and a couple others. But this is not a movie where Capra embraces any kind of new world, although it is in color, and the color in the movie is nice, but like I said, set in the past. I almost turned it off when I realized that. The movie starts with Bette Davis's character, Apple Annie, saying, "God bless everybody," and taking a big swig of liquor. She's kind of speaking to camera here. Then we see her walking down the street in New York selling her apples. She sells one by placing it in the hand of a gesticulating passer-by. He gives her a nickel, and she says, "Thank you, Mr. Rockefeller," sarcastically. We get the opening credits here, and then we launch into a really schmaltzy song. I guess this is the song that was nominated for Best Original Song, and I gotta tell you, there must not have been much competition at the time, because this is really nothing special. This isn't a musical, but it has an opening number and music here and there. The music actually is maybe one of the biggest hints at what the tone of this movie will be. Before the opening number starts up, we have a bunch of over-the-top vamps, melodramatic kind of stuff, and these vamps are sampling from various Christmas melodies. This movie came out on December 19th. Either the studio was planning for something saccharine all along, or that was the only time that they thought they could release a movie like this. The long and short of it is that before you make it about 5 minutes into the movie, before the opening credits have finished, it's clear what kind of movie this is going to be. Of course, none of this should really be a surprise. The movie is called Pocketful of Miracles. Like I said, I almost turned it off. In fact, it took me 2 tries to get all the way through the movie. Now, the film does have some endearing moments, which I will get to, but unless you're a big fan of Bette Davis, I wouldn't recommend it. I'm going to run through some of the high points, some of the low points, but then I want to get back to talking about Frank Capra and talk about how this movie follows some of his blueprints, but also how a lot of Capra hallmarks are not here, and how this narrative of Capra being too optimistic for the post-war period might be a bit simplistic. Maybe the answer somewhere in this movie about where it all went wrong. We'll see. Let me first start with some basics of the story. Like I said, Bette Davis plays Apple Annie, an alcoholic tramp who sells apples. Glenn Ford plays Dave the Dude. Now you know where Big Lebowski got its ideas. The Dude here is a nightclub owner. Hope Lang? I don't know how to pronounce her name, to be honest, who I guess was Glenn Ford's much younger girlfriend at the time, plays nightclub star Queenie Martins. Peter Falk plays Dave the Dude's henchman, his main henchman, Joy Boy. From the names alone, you can probably see that this is not going to be a great movie, or at least it's not going to be my kind of movie. These characters of the tramp, the nightclub star, the nightclub owner, are part of a vocabulary of classic Hollywood. Sometimes the tramp can be an interesting character. In some movies, the tramp is a radical character, gives us a look into working class life, which was otherwise almost non-existent on screen. This is a complicated topic, but I'll just say that this movie is set during the Great Depression, more or less. And, these days when we think about the Great Depression, we probably picture Hoovervilles and soup lines. The working class are at the forefront of our conception of the Depression, I would imagine. But in this movie and a lot of other classic movies, you really don't see that stuff. There are exceptions like Sullivan's Travels and like some of Capra's earlier films, actually. But this tramp archetype did a lot of heavy lifting in classic Hollywood, standing in for the reality of the working class and the Depression itself. This is inherently kind of reductive, but some movies do a pretty good job. This isn't one of them. Let me get back to the plot for a second. At first, it seems like this is mainly going to be a movie about Dave the Dude, who has a tangential connection to Annie, and that she is his Apple supplier. I don't mean iPhones. Dave, for some reason, thinks that Apple Annie's apples are lucky, and he must have one before making any big deals. Dave starts making deals with the mob not too long after this film begins, and he starts honing in on a marriage to Queenie. The head of the mob, by the way, is played by Sheldon Leonard, who does a great job. There's a nice episode of The Dick Van Dyke Show where Sheldon Leonard plays a gangster named Max Calvada. That show is actually produced by Calvada Productions, which Sheldon Leonard was a part of. The L in Calvada comes from his name. Apparently, Sheldon Leonard was the guy who suggested that they cast Dick Van Dyke. Pretty good idea. That episode came out after this movie, and honestly, I think it's more funny and more interesting than this entire film, even though it's only 25 minutes. Anyway, the pacing of this movie is pretty weird. Like I said, it seems at first like Dave is going to be the main character, and it seems like it's going to be maybe a story about Queenie's rise to fame in the nightclub and Dave's revival of this club. But then they kind of fast forward through all of that, and it seems like it's going to actually be a story about Dave, the dude, making deals with gangsters. But then the movie comes back around to Apple Annie, who ends up being at the center of everything. I'm going to spoil a couple things here. This is not really a great movie, and this is in the middle of the movie. I won't tell you what happens in the end, although you could probably guess. It turns out that Apple Annie has a daughter in Europe. Annie has been telling this daughter that she lives in a fancy hotel, and she's apparently been sending her an allowance gained from the Apple business, which I guess is more lucrative than you might think. It's maybe implied that there's something else going on amid the tramps. I'm not sure. It turns out that the daughter is going to get married to some Spanish aristocrat, the son of a Spanish aristocrat, and she wants to come visit her mom, bring her fiancé and her fiancé's father in New York before the wedding can go ahead. So you can probably guess what's going to happen. Remember, this is a remake of a movie called Lady for a Day. Queenie is going to convince Dave the Dude to forget about this mob business and instead finance a makeover for Apple Annie so she doesn't let down her daughter with her poverty. To me, this is an extremely tired plot line. And I bring it up not really to criticize it for that, but more because I think it shows how the movie isn't doing much with the tramp character. The message really is that you don't want to be a tramp, that the solution to all of the problems in this film is upper middle class couple formation. The solution to all the problems in the world, potentially, upper middle class couple formation. Now, I will say that Apple Annie is maybe slightly edgier than tramps in previous decade. Her drinking is on display. I think that's maybe just because this movie's from 1961. There are moments where you admire her resolve, but she also does seem to have a real problem with alcohol. In a better movie, this tension might be profitable and interesting, but here it's just a bit confusing. And then when the makeover begins, this is kind of all forgotten. Maybe alcohol serves as a loose proxy for poverty, I guess, in this movie. Like I said, we don't do much with the tramp. We use the classic vocabulary: tramps, nightclubs, gangsters, but it feels dated. It probably would have felt dated even when the movie came out. There are, like I said, good movies that use these tropes, but here everything is very superficial, and the film itself goes kind of against some of Capra's previous work. and takes a very loose way out of the conflict, resolving things mainly via sort of the vague acquisition of wealth. I said I was going to mention some good things about this movie. Bette Davis is pretty good in this movie. Peter Falk is extremely goofy in this movie. If you're a fan of his, you might check this out as a sort of oddity. I'm not sure what to say about the performance itself. Peter Falk, in his autobiography, which I have sitting over there somewhere, has mentioned a few things in this movie. There's a scene where he was trying to put on a jacket, and he's supposed to not be able to put on the jacket, and this is supposed to be funny. And it was very tricky for him to do this. This movie, I guess, is a comedy to some degree, but it's one of these movies where you're never really sure if it's supposed to be a comedy. I mean, I guess it is, but it was not particularly funny to me, at least. There's a moment. There's a joke here and there that are okay, I guess. Anyway, he's trying to put on the jacket, but failed to do it. And he could never quite get the hang of it. Frank Capra told him to take a break, and they came back and did another take later, and one take, and it was perfect. And Peter Falk, after the take, looked into the jacket, and you realized that Frank Capra had asked someone to sew up the sleeve of the jacket so he didn't have to act. Peter Falk talked very highly of Frank Capra in that biography, but to be fair, it's not exactly a seething work. He says he's pretty positive about many of the people he talks about. It's not clear exactly how he felt about this movie. I said earlier that I really like the color in this film. There are a couple of scenes that look really good, honestly. The scenes in the nightclub, for instance, may be my favorite shots in a nightclub in any movie. Maybe I'm exaggerating a bit, but they're cool. And for some reason, they look really modern. The set decoration is great. There's one angle they use in particular, kind of a mid-shot from the front of the stage, roughly at eye level of the performers. And maybe I'm making too much out of this, but this shot does not look like it came from 1961, and it really has an energy to it. There's another really interesting shot towards the end of the movie when Annie's daughter is singing to her fiance, as one does. Cool. It's a cool shot. The end of this movie is probably the strongest part, and I would say, could be worse. The end, I would say, begrudgingly, is okay. Anyway, returning to Frank Capra, one thing that this movie makes clear is that it isn't simply that Capra's formula was no longer compelling. This isn't a great Frank Capra movie that failed to land because times had moved out from under it. This is a mediocre Frank Capra movie that failed to land because it isn't very good and because times had changed. To me, it doesn't even seem that much like a Frank Capra movie in some ways. It is schmaltzy, certainly, but I don't know. I don't think that Capra is just defined by schmaltziness and positivity. I think in some ways it doesn't have that much in common with his big movies, with the ones that are my favorites. This isn't really a populist movie. For instance, a lot of Frank Capra's films feature some kind of politics of self-reliance and determination. This is a very American thing, this idea that a certain kind of upstander can never be beaten down. Okay, Capra's made a lot of different movies, and they're not all the same, but he has a pretty identifiable signature, and I don't really see that much of it here. There isn't even a single rich person that gets a comeuppance at the end, practically a staple of Capra films. In some ways, it seems like maybe they try to add a little bit of nuance. There's a little bit of tension with Annie Apple's character, like she has a bit of a drinking problem. It's not quite as perhaps didactic in some ways. Or Dave the Dude, for instance, doesn't really seem like that great of a guy for large parts of the movie. He seems pretty sleazy. You wonder why the heck Queenie would ever marry this guy. In some ways, maybe that's adding a little bit of edge. In some way, maybe it's adding a little bit of nuance. But in fact, it ends up just making it kind of confusing and weird. There are some interesting Capra things in it, though. For instance, Queenie wants to leave New York City and move to Maryland or someplace like that. Frankly, anywhere outside of New York, sort of interchangeable to me. No, I'm kidding. But this invokes a little bit of this country versus city thing that you see in a lot of Frank Capra films, like Mr. Smith Goes to Washington or Mr. Deeds Goes to Town. At one point in modern America, I guess, this question of the country versus the city was like this big thing, like this really logical structure. And, not just in America, but throughout world cinema, you got like Sunrise, a classic example of, stories about that are really structured around the city versus the country. And Capra has some of that in his early movies. By the 60s, this becomes maybe a little bit less common, although on television there was, the Beverly Hillbillies or the the show about the people who go to the farm. I forget what it's called. Anyway, this movie's got that a little bit. It's also interesting to see the international components in this movie. Like I said, there's a Spanish aristocrat here, and that's kind of interesting. The political angles in this movie are weird. They're interesting. Capra has a lot of sort of maybe anti-corruption themes in some of his other movies, standing up for the common man, things like that. In this movie, we get a glimpse of the government in New York, and we see that it is apparently a little bit corrupt, although you'll have to watch to the end to see exactly how this all pans out. A bit weird. Like I said, maybe another case where he's trying to add some nuance, but it just ends up sort of tripping up some of the mechanics of the film and making the movie a bit more mediocre. Yeah, I don't know. Now, if I didn't have a day job and a bunch of stuff to do, I would have watched the original movie so that I could compare them. Maybe I will for a future video. I wish I had had the time. Generally, people seem to prefer the original. I'm curious if it addresses the Depression differently, given that it was made during it. I'm curious if it's as cheesy. At the moment, I can't give you a rigorous eulogy of Frank Capra's career. It would take a huge amount of research to unravel all the factors. But the rough story is interesting. Frank Capra resigned from the presidency of the Directors Guild of America to enlist in the U.S. Army during World War II. You probably know this already. He made a widely seen series called the Why We Fight series. He made a film called The Negro Soldier. I've never watched any of his military output, but I am curious about it. I suspect it is somewhat one-dimensional, but I may do a follow-up with some of those movies at some point. Capra built up a strong relationship with the U.S. Army and the U.S. government, although the HUAC stuff may have sabotaged that or reshaped it to some degree. Capra also tried to enlist again in the early 50s to serve in the Korean War in a similar capacity, I guess, but he was rejected because he was too old. At this point, his Hollywood career would really start to wind down. Capra spent some of his time making educational films with Caltech. A lot of them have really overblown names about, Hemo, the Kingdom of the Sun, and Adonis, Poseidon of the Seas. I've made those up. The Sun one is something like that. Anyway, these were apparently somewhat widely screened for a number of decades, but I think they're now probably hugely out of date. Those might also be interesting to watch. I'm a little bit fascinated by directors who've worked in corporate cinema too. I mentioned that a little bit in the video about Hermano Olmi a couple weeks ago, how he started off his career working for Edison Volta in Milan. Anyway, Capra had a strong connection with Caltech. He left his ranch to Caltech to be a retreat center, I guess. His career was certainly dwindling. You can find some quotes from Capra's biography talking about changes in Hollywood. He said that it became salacious, that it was selling to degenerates, making movies about hedonists, God-haters, and homosexuals. His words, not mine. Capra's biography was published in 1971, and in 1971, this accusation was arguably true. To me, it sounds like a good thing. No doubt Hollywood had changed. But when I think about a big watershed moment, I don't think of 1945. I think of 1960. It's no surprise that Capra didn't like modern films, as in movies after the classic era, this European influence and such. There were plenty of directors who were successful in the classic era and the modern era, like my hero, Fred Zinnemann. But Capra was not in that category. The question to me was what happened in 1945? Like I said, 1960, sure. I get it that he was not a fan of Midnight Cowboy or whatever. Of course not. But what happened? Why is it the post-war period that we end up talking about? Well, obviously, a lot of things happened in 1945. World War II ended, as you may know. And a lot of things changed in American culture. Sure, there was no more Great Depression. There was no war to bring the country together. These things, not at the same time, had defined basically all of Capra's career. There'd been a strong nationalist core, I guess. And you might say that Capra needed something to pin the underlying messages of his movies to, I guess. But I don't know. That makes his movies sound, I think, a lot more simplistic than they were. Furthermore, there were plenty of nationalistic films in the 50s. Maybe some of these leveraged consumerism in a way that Capra might not have been interested in. His films, interesting question. His films, are they consumerist? I think maybe not as much as a lot of movies in the 50s. Anyway, in truth, it's been a long time since my original run through Capra's big, famous films. I watched most of them when I was in high school, and at the time they seemed to be at home within the era, within a sea of other moralistic films. A lot of Those other movies, of course, were probably inspired by Capra, whose influence is hard to overstate. Where some directors maybe adopted political proclivities as part of genre convention, maybe Capra actually believed in them. Capra's politics are a bit complicated, and they don't really map on today's party. In fact, many of his films with themes of anti-corruption, charity, empathy, community, and evil rich people can seem progressive even today. If you ignore all the misogyny and racism, there are still progressive ideas in his movies. But, Capra himself was fairly conservative. He was against the New Deal, for instance, which is interesting given all the tramps that show up in his films. I'm not saying that's hypocritical. I'm really just saying it's kind of interesting. In some ways, Capra might have been too big to adapt, where a lot of directors have had to change their tune to keep up with the times, where that's just been the business. A lot of directors in this era showed up in America from other places. Of course, Capra himself was an immigrant. And, you show up to be a director and you see these are the rules. These are the kind of movies we make in Hollywood, and you do it. And, as times change, maybe you also change. That's understating things a little bit. There's always been a push and pull between director and convention. But anyway, Capra had an iconic sensibility and was used to being in a position of reverence and power. Another thing he says in his biography a couple times is that one thing that drove him away from Hollywood was because actors were becoming too powerful. Again, I'm not exactly sure what era he's talking about here. It's true that the studio system, in winding down, changed the way that movies were made and changed the way that stars had been used, but I'm not sure that actors being more powerful is the way that I would put that. I mean, actors in the Hollywood system were extremely important, and I don't know. Like I said, I'm not even really sure what era he's talking about. Anyway, maybe Capra, like I said, was too big to adapt. He had this sensibility and this power. He was used to these ideas, and that's a good way to become a grumpy old man. What can I say? Why exactly would he have needed to adapt after the war? I'm not totally sure. But from the bits of his biography that I have read, he doesn't seem very interested in any kind of compromise. If anything, his newer movies might actually be more dated than his older ones. At the end of the day, though, directors aren't really judged for their biographies or what they were thinking about while making their movies. Capra made fewer movies because the ones he made weren't very successful. And that's how a career can go. Sometimes you make some great movies and people like you, but then the winds change. You have a string of failures and you're no longer a famous director. In the case of It's a Wonderful Life, seemingly it was a fluke that the film wasn't successful. But with A Pocketful of Miracles, it wasn't. This simply isn't a very good movie, and the mediocrity on show, it doesn't really answer any of my questions. So I feel a bit bad about this video because I really don't have an intuition for why it all went wrong. Look, at the high level, sure, I think it's a great fact. It's a very interesting thing to think about. Capra defined a generation of Hollywood, and the war ended, and society seemingly changed in a way that made his style irrelevant. That's the story. And that's not unprecedented, even. You can see, even now, big changes in certain industries. If you look at, like, cinema in India, for instance, and you look at sort of the rise of the masala film in the early 2000s until sort of the late 2010s and how that has shifted in the last few years, you can see. Now, these changes don't usually happen all at once. They don't happen overnight. But there are real shifts in what is considered the new thing, what people want to see. But on the other hand, I don't know. Something about that story of Frank Capra just seems a little unsatisfying to me, and I still fundamentally don't quite understand why a good Frank Capra movie couldn't have been made in the 50s. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem like we have any good Frank Capra movies in the 50s to really test out any of the theories. So, I don't know. Sadly, I also brought you a pretty lousy movie in this review that I wouldn't really recommend, but I may do a follow-up with some of his other films. There's a few books about this that I don't know, maybe I'll read. I would like to continue thinking about the mysterious disappearance of Frank Capra. If you have any theories about it, let me know.